They called him Theron the Sightless, and people traveled across mountain ranges and stormy seas just to kneel before him in his temple carved from marble and grief. Kings abandoned their thrones for weeks. Merchants left their fortunes unguarded. Mothers clutched sick children to their chests as they climbed the 1,000 steps to his sanctuary. They came because the Ran could see what no mortal should see, the exact moment of your death, the face of your betrayer, the child who would destroy everything you built. His prophecies never failed. Not once in 30 years had his visions proven false, and that perfect accuracy made him the most feared and revered man in all of Hellas. But here's what twisted the knife in everyone's heart. Theron himself lived in absolute darkness. His eyes had been taken by the gods the night he received his gift, burned away by divine fire until only empty sockets remained. He wrapped them in strips of consecrated linen that never came off. Not even when he slept. People whispered that he'd seen something so terrible in his own future that he'd begged the gods to blind him permanently, to make it impossible for him to ever look into his own fate. Others claimed he was terrified of what he might discover, that the man who knew everyone's ending was too cowardly to face his own. The truth was darker and stranger than any rumor, and it had been eating him alive for 3 decades. Every person who entered his temple walked out with knowledge that changed them forever. But Theron remained trapped in his present, deliberately, desperately ignorant of the one future that mattered most. Before we descend into the oracle's temple and uncover what really happened on the night he lost his sight, I need to know something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I'm curious how far these ancient stories travel. Are you listening from São Paulo, New York, Mumbai, or somewhere I've never heard of? Let me know, because every view from a different corner of the world adds another layer to these timeless myths. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the night when a young priest named Theron had both his eyes and his innocence. Before the gods noticed him, the temple of Apollo stood on the cliffs of Delphi, where eagles circled and the wind carried voices from the underworld. Theron was nobody special then, just another acolyte who swept floors and lit incense, who memorized prayers and tried not to fall asleep during the long ceremonies. He had a girl he loved in the village below, a fisherman's daughter named Alethea, with black hair that smelled like salt and laughter that made the world feel less heavy. They planned to marry after the summer harvest, to have 3 children and grow old watching sunsets from their small stone house. Theron's future was ordinary and beautiful, and he wanted nothing more. But the gods have always hated ordinary happiness, and Apollo had been watching him with interest that felt like being studied by a predator. The high priestess of the temple was dying, her prophecies growing weaker as illness consumed her body. Apollo needed a replacement, and he'd chosen Theron for reasons. The young priest would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. It happened on the night of the new moon, when darkness swallowed the cliffs and the temple fell silent except for the distant crash of waves against rocks far below. Theron was alone in the inner sanctum, cleaning the altar where the priestess performed her rituals. He'd just finished wiping away the remnants of burned offerings when the god arrived, not announced by thunder or earthquakes, but simply present, filling the room with light that had no source and heat that came from everywhere at once. Apollo stood before him in a form that hurt to perceive, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, his eyes containing every sunrise and sunset that had ever existed. The god spoke without moving his lips, and his voice resonated inside Theron's skull like a second heartbeat. He offered a gift that mortals killed for, the ability to see anyone's fate with perfect clarity, to become the most powerful oracle in human history. All Theron had to do was accept, and he would gain immortality of a kind, his name spoken with reverence for generations. But Apollo didn't mention the cost, not clearly, and Theron was young and stupid and drunk on divine attention. He said yes before he understood what yes meant, and the god smiled in a way that contained no warmth whatsoever. The transformation felt like drowning, in liquid starlight while someone rewired his brain with burning copper wire. Theron collapsed on the marble floor, convulsing as his mind expanded beyond its mortal limitations. Suddenly he could see everything, threads of fate stretching from every person in Delphi, glowing paths that showed their futures, branching into thousands of possibilities before collapsing into one inevitable outcome. He saw the baker's son, who would die in 3 days from a fall, the merchant who would betray his brother for a handful of silver, the child who would become a tyrant and burn cities. The visions came so fast and violent that he vomited onto the sacred floor, and still they kept coming. Then he made his mistake, the one that would define the next 30 years of his existence. In desperation, seeking something stable and familiar to anchor himself, Theron turned his new vision inward. He looked at his own fate the way you might look at your reflection in a mirror, expecting comfort and recognition. Instead, he saw his death in such vivid, horrifying detail that his mind nearly shattered from the impact. Not just the moment of his death, but the betrayal that led to it, the agony that preceded it, and worst of all, the person who would kill him. Someone he loved, someone whose face he recognized immediately. The knowledge was so devastating that Theron started screaming, clawing at his own eyes, begging Apollo to take the vision back. The god did something then that might have been mercy or might have been cruelty. With Apollo, the distinction never mattered. He burned away Theron's physical sight completely, searing his eyes until they were nothing but ash in their sockets. The pain was transcendent, a white-hot agony that eclipsed every other sensation, until Theron thought he might die right there on the temple floor. But when the burning finally stopped and the last of his vision faded to permanent darkness, he realized Apollo's gift remained intact. He could still see fate, still pierce the veil of time and glimpse the futures of anyone who stood before him. The only thing he couldn't see anymore was his own destiny, not because the knowledge was gone, but because he deliberately, desperately locked it away in the deepest corner of his mind where he'd never have to look at it again. The memory of what he'd seen was still there, sealed behind walls of self-imposed ignorance, and every day for 30 years, he'd fought the temptation to remember. Alethea found him the next morning, guided by his screams that had echoed down the cliffs to the village. She held his ruined face and wept, but she didn't leave him, not then, and that somehow made everything worse. Theron became the greatest oracle in Greece, exactly as Apollo had promised. People came from every corner of the known world, seeking his visions, and he gave them truth without exception, because lies were impossible now. He told a general which of his soldiers would betray him, and watched as the man executed 3 innocent people, based on imperfect understanding. He told a queen that her favorite son would die before reaching manhood, and she locked the boy in a tower, where he suffocated in the fire trying to escape his fate. He told a merchant that his business partner was sleeping with his wife, and the man murdered them both, then hanged himself when he discovered the vision had been metaphorical. The partner was sleeping on the job, neglecting their shared enterprise. Every prophecy was accurate. Every prophecy caused agony. Theron delivered futures with the mechanical precision of an executioner's blade, never softening the truth, never offering false comfort. The temple grew wealthy from offerings and sacrifices, but Theron himself lived like an ascetic, eating barely enough to survive, sleeping on a thin mat in a cell that smelled of incense and despair. Alethea stayed by his side despite everything, now his caretaker rather than his lover, and he hated himself for letting her waste her life on his darkness. She deserved the fisherman's life they'd planned, the children and sunsets and simple happiness. But she refused to leave, and he was too selfish to insist. Years accumulated like scars, and Theron's reputation grew until his name was spoken in the same breath as the ancient oracles of legend. Kings consulted him before declaring war. Judges brought him criminals to determine guilt. Parents asked him which of their children would bring honor or shame to the family name. He answered everyone with the same cold precision, never refusing a supplicant, never turning away even when the visions nauseated him with their cruelty. The only request he always denied came from Alethea herself, who begged him annually to look into her future, to tell her if staying with him would bring her happiness or ruin. He refused every time, and she never understood that his refusal was its own kind of answer. He'd already seen her fate in the chaotic moments after his transformation, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge. She would die because of him, because of choices they'd both make, and telling her wouldn't change anything except to add years of dread to her remaining time. So he kept silent and hated himself more with each passing season, trapped between the divine gift that made him valuable and the human love that made him vulnerable. The prophecy that changed everything came on a winter morning when frost covered the temple. Steps and the sky hung low and gray over Delphi. A young soldier arrived at dawn, his armor dented from recent battle, his face bearing the kind of
exhaustion that comes from seeing friends die. His name was Koios, and he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone trying not to fall apart in public. Theron sensed his fate before the man even spoke, a future so tangled with his own that their destinies were braided together like rope. Koios had a simple question that contained multitudes. Should he return home to his family's farm, or continue fighting in the war that had already taken two of his brothers? Theron reached out with his inner sight, following the threads of the soldier's future, and what he saw made his hands tremble against the arms of his oracle's chair. In one path, Koios went home and lived a long, quiet life, dying peacefully in old age. In the other path, he stayed in the war and died within the month, bayoneted in a muddy field while calling for his mother. But there was a third element to the vision that Theron couldn't ignore. If Koios stayed and died, his death would set off a chain of events that would somehow, impossibly, lead to Theron's own end. Theron sat in his darkness, frozen by a choice that shouldn't have been difficult. His entire existence as an oracle demanded he tell the truth, the complete truth, no matter how painful. But for the first time in 30 years, he felt the foundations of his purpose crack beneath the weight of self-preservation. If he told Koios to go home, the soldier would live. But Theron's own fate would remain, locked on its current trajectory, toward whatever terrible end he'd glimpsed and buried. If he told Koios to stay in the war, knowing the man would die, Theron might somehow alter the chain of causation and save himself. The prophecy chamber fell silent, except for the sound of both men breathing, and Theron felt the weight of 3 decades of perfect honesty pressing against this one moment of possible deception. Alethea stood in the corner. She always attended his prophecies now, his witness and his conscience, and he could feel her watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The correct answer was obvious. Tell Koios to go home, save the man's life, accept whatever fate had planned for Theron himself. But gods and fate had taken everything from him, his sight, his future with Alethea, his chance at ordinary happiness. Did he owe them continued obedience? Did he owe them his death? Theron opened his mouth and lied for the first time since Apollo had burned away his eyes. He told Koios that both paths led to the same destination. That fate had already decided and his choice didn't matter, that he should follow his heart because the outcome was fixed regardless. It was a coward's answer, a nothing answer, designed to let the soldier make his own choice while Theron's hands stayed technically clean. Koios stared at him in confusion. People came to the oracle for certainty, not philosophical ambiguity, but eventually nodded and left the temple without leaving an offering. The moment he was gone, Alethea crossed
the chamber and slapped Theron hard enough that his head snapped to the side. She'd been with him long enough to recognize the texture of his prophecies, and she knew he'd just broken the one rule that defined his entire existence. He expected her to rage at him, to demand an explanation. But instead, she did something worse. She asked him quietly if the lie had been to save himself, and the question hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be answered without confirming her suspicion. Theron said nothing, and in his silence, their relationship shifted from devotion to something colder and more fragile. Koios returned to the war and died exactly as Theron had foreseen, bayoneted in a field outside Thebes while trying to drag a wounded friend to safety. News of his death reached Delphi 3 weeks later. and Theron received it alone in his cell, feeling the weight of the soldier's ended life pressing against his conscience like a physical thing. He'd killed Koyos as surely as if he'd held the blade himself, not through action, but through deliberate, cowardly inaction. The realization should have destroyed him, should have made him confess everything to Alethea and beg forgiveness he didn't deserve. Instead, it revealed something darker that had been growing in him for 3 decades. He was tired of being Apollo's instrument, tired of delivering agonies he couldn't prevent, tired of living as a conduit for divine will while his own humanity rotted from neglect. The lie had felt almost good in the moment of speaking it, a small rebellion against the god who'd stolen his eyes and his future. It had also felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years, choosing himself, choosing survival, even if it meant blood on his hands. That night, alone in his darkness, Theron made a decision that would bring his 30-year service crashing down around him. He would look at his own fate again, not the way he'd accidentally glimpsed it during his transformation, but deliberately and completely, understanding every detail of his coming death and the betrayal that would cause it. Knowledge had always been his weapon and his curse, and he was done hiding from the one truth that mattered. If he was going to die, he wanted to see it coming. If someone he loved was going to kill him, he wanted to know who and why and whether he deserved it. Most importantly, he wanted to know if the lie he'd told Koyos had actually changed anything, or if fate was so rigid that even an oracle's deception couldn't alter the fundamental shape of destiny. The decision felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in complete darkness, knowing that the next step would either be solid ground or empty air. Alethea slept in the next room, her breathing audible through the thin wall, and Theron wondered if she was the one he'd seen in that first devastating vision. It would make a certain terrible sense. She was the only person left in his life he still loved enough to be destroyed.
That read like a spy novel, except they were real. They had actually happened, and her grandparents had been at the center of it all. But it was the recording that stopped Emma's breath entirely. A reel-to-reel tape, carefully labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. Operation Nightingale, October 1961. And underneath, in smaller letters, the operation that should never have happened. Emma stared at the reel-to-reel tape, knowing she couldn't play it here. Couldn't risk anyone else hearing what was recorded on it. She carefully photographed the documents with her phone, working quickly but thoroughly, making sure she captured every page, every photograph, every scrap of evidence her grandmother had preserved. The story they told was staggering. Operation Nightingale had been a joint intelligence effort to extract a high-level defector from mainland China through Taiwan. The defector supposedly had information about Soviet nuclear capabilities being shared with Beijing, intelligence that could shift the entire balance of Cold War power. Margaret and Robert had been key players. Margaret as the Chinese-speaking liaison who would make initial contact, Robert as the operations coordinator who would manage the extraction logistics. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. Emma found a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, from the Taipei Times, dated October 17, 1961. The headline read, "Explosion at Harbor District Warehouse Kills 5. The article described it as an industrial accident, but someone, probably her grandmother, had written in the margins, "Not an accident, ambush, they knew we were coming." More documents filled in the picture. The defector had been real, but he'd been a double agent. The Soviets had known about Operation Nightingale from the beginning, had fed false information through the defector to draw out Western intelligence operatives, and had planned to capture or kill them all in one coordinated strike. The explosion had been intended to eliminate everyone involved. It had nearly succeeded. 5 people died that night. Emma found their names listed in an after-action report. 3 Taiwanese intelligence officers, 1 CIA operative, and 1 British MI6 agent, except the British agent's name made Emma's blood run cold. James Rothschild, presumed killed in the explosion. The man who'd called her yesterday was using the name of a dead spy. Emma's hands were shaking now as she dug deeper into the box. She found a personal letter, written in her grandmother's handwriting, dated 1995, 34 years after the operation. It appeared to be addressed to Emma, written when Emma was just 8 years old, but clearly meant to be read much later. "My dearest Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, you found what I've hidden, and you're probably confused and frightened and angry at me for keeping so much from you. I understand all of those feelings. I've carried them myself for decades. The truth about Operation..."
Him dress and guided him to the prophecy chamber where the days. Supplicants were already gathering, desperate people with desperate questions, seeking truths they'd regret learning. Theron took his seat and prepared to spend his final months doing what he'd always done, delivering futures with perfect accuracy, watching as people walked away carrying knowledge that would reshape their lives. The only difference now was that he finally understood his own ending, and the understanding made him almost grateful to the god who'd chosen him. Apollo had taken his eyes and his happiness and his chance at an ordinary life. But in exchange, the god had given him the one thing that justified all of it, a death that would matter. 3 months remained before the visitor arrived, before the betrayal, before the weapon and Alethea's face and the final prophecy that would echo through history long after everyone forgot Theron's name. He would use that time to prepare, not for survival, but for the perfect delivery of his last and most important truth. The one vision he would give freely, rather than selling for offerings and gold.